You're listening to episode 98 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Dr. Nicholas Van Dam joins us to speak about the recent paper, Mind the Hype, a critical evaluation and prescriptive agenda for research on mindfulness and meditation. Several years ago, thanks to the kindness of a friend, I was fortunate enough to be included in a gathering sponsored by the Mind and Life Institute. Present were many old friends, soon-to-be new friends, to discuss a shared interest in the state of scientific study of mindfulness. After collaboration, disagreement, partnership, and even loss, the resulting paper has been published in the journal Prescriptive on Psychological Science. Today, the lead author joins us to give voice to the intention and call to action we hope will come of this work. Nicholas T. Van Dam is a research fellow, assistant professor equivalent, at the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne, Australia. He holds an appointment of adjunct assistant professor in the Mood and Anxiety Disorders program in the Department of Psychiatry the Agend School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. Nicholas completed a BS in Neurobiology and Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. After deciding medical training would not fulfill his career objectives, Nicholas joined the laboratory of Dr. Harriet DeWitt at the University of Chicago as a post-baccalaureate research assistant. He subsequently completed an MA and PhD under the supervision of Dr. Mitch Earlywine in clinical psychology at the University at Albany. During his third year of PhD training, Nicholas joined the laboratory of Dr. Jin Fan as a visiting scholar at Agend School of Medicine at Mount Sinai to learn neuroimaging. Prior to completing his PhD in clinical psychology, Nicholas did a predoctoral fellowship in psychiatry at Yale University with Dr. Rajita Sinha. He subsequently worked at the New York University and the Nathan Klein Institute with Drs. Don C. Goff and Michael P. Milham. Nicholas then returned to Mount Sinai to help establish a neuroimaging arm to the Mood and Anxiety Disorders program under the supervision of Dr. James Murrow and Prentik Kundu. Special thanks to Dr. Kathy Kerr. Without her care, initiative, and love, this project would not have come to fruition. Kathy, this is dedicated to you. You are sorely missed. Our guest today is Nicholas T. Van Dam. Nicholas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Very good to be seeing you again. And this has been quite a journey on this particular paper, but let's start by having you just tell us a bit about your background.
Sure. So my formal training is as a clinical psychologist. So I studied in, obviously, clinical psychology for years and actually practiced while I was training. I did quite a bit of research and work in neuroscience during my PhD. So I left with the permission of my faculty, left my institution and learned neuroimaging methods. I started during graduate school doing some research and work on meditation and mindfulness research, and that carried into, to some extent, my work in neuroimaging, although I, at various phases, and we can talk more about this, I dropped a bit of that for various reasons and have kind of come back to it in various ways. But yeah, so my postdoctoral training as well has been in psychiatric neuroimaging. And also I've sort of continued to work on self-report assessment and measurement, and have spent a lot of time most recently sort of not necessarily to my great interest or to my great desire. I've been involved in sort of some clinical trials in a psychiatric context. So I have been able to sort of see what these the normal randomized clinical controlled type trial looks like in the Department of Psychiatry in drug settings, which has been quite interesting. And currently I'm working at the University of Melbourne in Australia as a research fellow, which is essentially the equivalent of an assistant professor.
So how did you get involved with this project we're going to be talking about today?
So this project, as you said, has been kind of a slog, and so we started debating some of the issues that came up in the final paper. God, it has to be 3.5, maybe even 4 years ago on Facebook and other sort of social media sites. Some of these conversations had been going on even prior to that, in back channels during Mind and Life and other sort of conferences. But really, they sort of came to a head on Facebook in a particular sort of discussion group, and that group kind of kept progressing, and the comments sort of really started to get unwieldy, not so much in the nature of them, but really just in the volume of them. And there were just so many, and so many people were so passionate, and we weren't really getting anywhere. And so there was this giant group of people who, incredible varied backgrounds that were interested in the topic. And we really sort of decided that we wanted to actually do something about it. And so it really was spearheaded by Kathy Kerr, who, we've since lost and who's since passed away. And Kathy really was kind of the motivating factor in starting to make something happen out of this. I remember I met with Kathy. She was visiting New York City, and I was in New York City at the time, and she came and met with me and kind of chatted to me about where she hoped some of this might go and what might happen. And Marieke van Voeks, coordinating with Mind and Life, was able to organize for a gathering of a select subgroup of us to get together and discuss this. And that happened, and that was well over 3 years ago. And since then, we've essentially been hashing and rehashing and writing and rewriting and figuring out how to best convey exactly what we wanted to say and coming to agreement and things of that term.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning Kathy. One of the things the highlights of the paper for me was seeing a special note about Kathy, and for listeners to the podcast are familiar with her. She has been a guest, and we did lose her in between that discussion at Mind and Life and the publication of the papers. It was just very heartwarming to see that in the paper.
Yeah, I personally thought it important to make sure we acknowledge that her contributions, and really she was kind of the spearhead. She started all.
So, say a little bit about the rest of the composition of the group. You don't have to name everybody, but just kind of who were these people? Why did they care?
Discussed this a couple of times. Every time I think this, I have to actually look at who's all involved, because it's been such a long process and I forget. But it's quite an eclectic group, and so when you think about who these individuals are, I think we've sort of covered the gamut in terms of, with the exception. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. I was going to say we don't have any true sort of Buddhist scholars, but we have Andy Alensky.
Andy was there too. Yeah.
We've got psychologists of varying kinds. We have neuroscientists. We have Buddhist practitioners. We have Buddhist scholars. Within psychology, we have clinical psychologists. We have social worker. We had someone who was focused predominantly on multiple types of neuroimaging. Kathy brought expertise in somatic and mind-body stuff, and Laura Schmaltz does a lot of yoga stuff. So, really, David Meyer background in both with Mind and Life, cognitive science. Cliff Sarin, was involved with meditation with Richie Davidson from the start in the 70s. Really, so not only covering the gamut of what you would hope for in this kind of what I always had thought of as a consensus piece, but also just in terms of representation of whatever contemplative science is to date. I think we've really got the bases covered here.
Yeah, it was a really amazing group just to see the faces sitting around the room as this was being discussed was really a rather unique gathering.
It was. I'd like to say, I had a couple of conversations with various other people that I think would have liked to have been a part. And I've sort of said to them that, both there were pros and cons, and it was an amazing conversation, and it was amazing conversations to be a part of, and it really was quite enjoyable. And everybody that was there was very passionate about the topic. And we would have liked to have had more people involved, but having been the person that sort of was tasked with herding the cats, so to speak, I definitely say that it would have been hard to have more people in the process. So
yeah. So let's talk about the paper itself. What are some of the highlights? What are the guts of this?
So the main focus or the main structure of the paper, I think, kind of has to do with two things. One is sort of definitions of mindfulness. So how do we define the idea of mindfulness? What is it? So that's kind of a big piece, and that's sort of crucial for everything else. And in the end, I think the highlight or the sort of takeaway point is we can't really, or we haven't really. And that's not to say that there isn't any definitions of mindfulness, or that no one has suggested anything, or that we don't have any. It's actually the opposite, that there have been so many definitions or so many proffered possibilities of what it means, that not that it's meaningless, but also it's so meaningful to so many people in so many ways that we can't be consistent about what we're talking about. And this is not necessarily a problem in everyday life when people are, talking about something they care about, although it can be quite confusing. But in research in particular, not having consistent terms and having those terms mean the same thing is a huge issue.
Yeah. Because one moment, what are we measuring here and how are we measuring it? And you have two studies that might be really great, but they're doing completely different, well, not completely different, but pretty varied things that are not necessarily overlapping so well.
Okay. Somebody asked me recently, what is your mindfulness? How do you de-stress? And I was kind of floored by the question. I was sort of thinking, well, I don't even know how to answer that, because those are not the same things to me. I thought that they may be related. Certainly mindfulness and sort of efforts to de-stress are related, but they're by no means equivalent. And so, that's kind of this idea that people take mindfulness to mean whatever. It's some people were talking about it in this particular instance as it was equivalent to listening to music, and that's the problem. Is sort of people have kind of taken this term and kind of run in whatever direction they want with it. And then of course there's, from the academic side, there's the disagreements among psychologists, Buddhist scholars, within the fields as well as across the field. So this is really, we highlight and discuss some of the various possibilities in the paper, and really sort of try to say, like, we need to come up with at least some way of making sure we're on the same page. And it doesn't mean that you can't use your favorite definition. It's just that you have to be clear about what your favorite definition entails. So if your favorite definition has, components of discernment, then fine, just be clear about that, right? So, mindfulness - discernment, right? Or if your favorite definition, for whatever reason, is the mindful attention awareness scale, sure, then just say that that's how you're defining it, right? And that's kind of one of the things that we're trying to say, is we're not banning the term of mindfulness being used, but we need some clarity. And right now, mindfulness means too many things to too many people. So,
yeah, one of the things I've noticed in that is that when the definition being used, if there is even one clearly articulated beyond, some very basic components, it's often criticized because it's not the critic's favorite definition of what mindfulness means, and particularly from a more orthodox or traditional definition of what they may mean by sati. Oh, you're not doing our thing, and therefore you're doing it wrong. It's like, well, we're doing something else. We're doing science here, and that has a different level of delineation in how we need to measure and test things and control for our biases.
Well, and that's a particularly sort of relevant or poignant position, or point you raised there, because when you talk about these constructs or these ideas that mean a lot to people in an everyday sense, take love or kindness or wisdom or whatever, you have it. we're not trying to, in doing science on these constructs, so if trying to measure scientifically what love is, we're not trying to take away any meaning of it. We're just trying to understand what its implications are, what it does to people. And in order to do that, we have to come up with some clear operational definition of the construct. Right. And so ultimately what that means is we have to reduce it to something. We have to simplify it in some way until we sort of really get a better sense of, well, which version or variation of love actually can best explain the effect.
So you raise a very good point here about, and I think this is one of the most important things in this exploration, is that it doesn't mean that by doing this clear delineation of what we mean for this scientific study, for a particular paper, a particular avenue of research, in any way takes away from what someone else is doing and what they are very passionate about.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important thing for people to keep in mind, is we're not trying to say that mindfulness is not whatever, it's not important, it's not meaningful, that the various Buddhist or whatever interpretations of mindfulness are not meaningful and are potentially not valuable and are not could be life-changing. We're not trying to challenge the various clinicians who would say, I've seen mindfulness and I know that it works from that perspective. We're not trying to challenge them, at least in terms of their personal experience. We are potentially trying to challenge them and saying, well, when you say you know it works, what do you mean? Because, right. And that's sort of starting to get in now to the second piece of the paper. The second part of the paper really focuses on two main components, right? So the two main components are really clinical research of mindfulness and neuroscience research of mindfulness. And the reason I think that we picked these two things, and I have a personal interest being that those are really two areas that I'm quite passionate about and have done a lot of research in, is that they often, not only do they get used interchangeably for good reason. I mean, the National Institutes of Health, particularly National Institutes of Mental Health, have decided that these are the two areas that are going to decide how we do clinical practice, right? We need to know what's going on in the brain and we need to know what's going on in the clinic. And those two things should inform one another. Now, there are different problems and there are similar problems in these areas. But in the end, I guess what I've seen a lot of is that evidence from one gets used to inform practice in the other, and evidence from the other sort of gets informed to use research in the other. And so I think people see flashy brain images and they then utilize that to say, oh, well, we had meditators in an MRI machine and this area of their brain lit up. That brain area happens to be related to depression. Therefore, mindfulness cures depression. And that's just a logical fallacy. And that doesn't work. And so that's a problem. And I've seen that in, a lot of clinical research, that this pairing of neuroscience and clinical research is not as tightly linked as it should be. So when you start to sort of divide or pour into these two areas of research, you see some different problems. And I'll go a bit into those. But I think at the end of the day, the main concern here is that these two areas of research are relatively underdeveloped in the sense that they're new and people haven't been doing this for very long. When you talk about brain imaging, it started in the late 90s. We really haven't been doing this for very long at all. And so that has its own problems. When you talk about contemporary psychiatric interventions, those haven't been around for very long either. So now you're adding to it this concept of mindfulness, which really hasn't been brought into the Western sphere, until Jon Kabat-Zinn made his push. And Ellen Langer sort of popularized an entirely different and otherwise confusing definition of it that was very different from John's. And then we've seen people try to do clinical research and neuroscience research. And somehow in the intervening years since it became sort of popular in about mid-2000s to do this work, and now you've seen this, tenfold increase in research being done in these realms. And at the same time, concordantly, what I've seen more, that is the part that really worries me, is approval by governments of mindfulness-based therapies. I've seen apps and seminars and workshops being offered to improve just about everything, including corporate citizenship, whatever that means. That was a term I came across in a Dan Goleman article the other day. And so mindfulness is somehow meant to make you a better business. And so places like Google and, other places like that are offering this. And so that's where it really bothers me, because at the end of the day, it's sort of, well, people are spending money on this. People are investing time in this, and particularly sick people are investing time in this. And so it's not just a failure to recognize that there actually might be some harms to this, which there are possible harms, but it's also the reality that in clinical treatment, if you're not getting a treatment that works, even if the other treatment is harmless, even if it does nothing, you're spending time doing something that's not helping you. So that's concerning, right? And really, the National Health Service in England is offering this now as a primary treatment. School kids are getting this. And everybody's sort of kind of default is, well, it's totally harmless and it's amazing. It does wonders. It changes the brain. And so really, the second piece of the paper is designed to inform people that, look, what we know, where we're at with the science of these areas is that we have potentially some evidence that there may be something there. There may be something useful. There's some evidence that it may even compare with some of our better treatments, but we don't have much evidence that it's better, if any. And we don't, in terms of the neuroimaging, there's a whole host of problems there where we don't totally know what brain areas it's influencing. And just a shortcoming or a limitation of neuroimaging, we don't always necessarily know what it means if it's related to those brain areas. Mm-hmm. So that these are all complicating issues. And I think these are all issues that we sort of tried to tackle in this paper. And we try to sort of provide some suggestions about, well, what can we actually say about what we know? And what do we really need to do going forward if this is going to continue as a field of research in a meaningful way? And if it's not going to go the route of TM and end up dying on the table?
Yeah, I think that's, there's so much in there. And from a lot of the press that you and I both seen since this got released, that there's a lot of conclusion jumping, often on one side or the other. And we'll skip to that part. A couple of the headlines that I've seen just the past few days in the popular press about this is mindfulness. And you were saying exactly the opposite earlier, and as would everyone else is on the paper. Mindfulness is a meaningless word with shoddy science behind it. We're not saying it's a meaningless word. We're saying there are, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of meanings that may be included in that. And then another one that I just saw today before we started recording tonight is mindfulness has become an overhyped racket with junk science supporting it, says researchers. I've said nothing of the kind. And
also, we're not all necessarily researchers. So.
And we're not all researchers. Yeah, I found it very interesting to get promoted into the role of psychologist. I had no idea.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks, Newsweek. I really appreciate it. So what I wanted to ask is some of your impressions on what you've seen occur since the release of the paper. I know there's been a great deal of discussion or revision from our team. And again, my thanks, I know that's reflected from every one of the co-authors to you for shepherding this through, because that was the lion's share. It was not a marathon. It was an ultra marathon. I'm grateful to your efforts on that. So what are some of the things that you're seeing as outcomes of this? And one of the things I do want you to mention is what we're seeing in the altmetrics on this.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think overall the media coverage has been, it's been fantastic, but there's a lot more coverage than I expected there would have been. I think a lot of people within the mindfulness movement, so to speak, I think dismissed this over the past 3 years and kind of thought it wouldn't amount to much of anything. And whatever ultimately, I don't know what they thought we would just sort of end up saying the same thing as everyone else, and it would just be, another puff piece on how great mindfulness is in the end, or it would the title would end up being why Buddhism is true and everyone should practice mindfulness or something, and it certainly hasn't come out as that. I guess. Speaking of which, we'd love to hear from Robert Wright at some point.
We actually will. Here, I'm setting Bob right now about his book. And for folks who are listening, Nicholas is laughing because I just held up for video for him to see my copy of Why Buddhism is True. So we will be speaking with Robert Wright about that soon.
A colleague of mine actually suggested that the title that I suggested could be the alternate title for Richie Davidson and Dan Goleman's new book, which is meant to be a critique and critical evaluation of current mindfulness research. So, But yeah, so look, I think as a whole, the media coverage has actually been pretty balanced. I think, and when I say balanced, I mean it actually seems to reasonably reflect our discussion. I think there are several problems with science and media in general. One is which, scientists often don't think in 140 characters. The things that we say are nuanced and complicated, and we elaborate, and we don't speak in ways that is necessarily sound biteable,
right.
If that makes sense. So I think that always sort of leads journalists, I think, to come up with ways of sensationalizing and or tweaking what we said to try and make it more interesting, more compelling, to get what they think our point across is. And I think, that to some extent is a shortcoming of ours, and that we sort of haven't figured out how to communicate with people better. And I think that's getting better across the whole of science. But I mean, certainly within the mindfulness arena, we need to do a better job. We need to be more clear about both the pros and the cons, and particularly the limitations of the work that we do. So, I think the two articles in particular that you mentioned, I think those are particular extreme examples that have taken our article in one particular direction. I honestly, when I saw the Newsweek article, was a bit shocked. A bit of a funny backstory to that. When Newsweek contacted to talk about it, so they contacted me that morning prior to it coming out, and I'm in Australia, so obviously the timing was not great. I got emailed at about 6:30 a.m. and was preparing my 2-month-old to go off to daycare for the day, 2-year-old, excuse me. And so I said, look, I can speak at my time at 9:30 when I get to my office. And the woman wrote back and said, "Oh, I've already got one of your other colleagues from the States who has agreed to speak with me." And my honest response was, "Oh shit, who is it?" And that's partially because I think the group as a whole has reflected a variety of positions throughout this. And some people have been more pro in terms of they think everything that's been happening is great and they're very optimistic. And there's been other people who have been more on the pessimistic end of things. And what I was concerned about is that it would go too far in one or the other directions. And I was concerned that what would come out would be something that was either too optimistic or too pessimistic. And I really didn't want that. And the person who they contacted was actually, in the end, someone that I sort of generally consider to be a bit of an optimist. And it's what I think is interesting to me, and I feel really bad for Dave Vago, because I think knowing him well and how passionate he is about this work, he was just wildly misrepresented. I mean, he was sort of the least of us that I thought of all the people that could have been interviewed, that was the least consistent with, I think, his personal view. And so it was just, it's unfortunate. In some ways, I think when you dig into the article itself, there's some decent writing there. There is some points that are reasonably reflective of what we said. But again, it's these buzzwords, meaningless and shoddy. I mean, I think those are really extreme. Some people have pointed out rightfully that, okay, well, meaningless, I guess we don't really have a great definition. So, okay, I guess, in some ways it might apply, but it just sort of, it engages this emotional response that doesn't seem appropriate. And shoddy science, again, I wouldn't say that all the science is shoddy. We often have said throughout the paper, it's lacking sufficient rigor. But that doesn't mean it's total garbage and that we should just disregard everything that anyone's done on this topic and start from scratch.
Right. And I would add into that some of the reasons that the science is at the place it is, and you've mentioned this, is it's a young field. It is a very complicated thing when you're talking about how people are thinking and feeling and their perceptions and their experiences. It's not like, oh, we can just measure an object falling in a vacuum. There, we've got our numbers, move on. It's a bit more than that. And it's also kind of expensive in an underfunded area. It costs $1,000 to load someone in an fMRI. Yes, of course, there are going to be small sample sizes and small cohorts when it's that expensive to do one paper. And that's also why we don't see a lot of replication, because there isn't the big bucks and big prestige for going where someone else has already gone before.
Yeah. And so look, this is a huge issue. I think it's an issue across areas, and that, the way that money is allocated to research is that it oftentimes is given to big names. And, being a big name at a big institution doesn't necessarily correlate with being the most rigorous, most objective scientist. And, so I was asked when speaking with Scientific American, who covered our article, about the two new articles that have come out by Tanya Singer's group. And, I had an interesting response to it because, I had to spend some time looking at them. I hadn't been aware of them. But I basically said, look, they were almost $2 million projects, at least from ERC funding. I know there was a lot of other money involved in it as well. So I'm guessing 2 million's, a low estimate for how much that cost. I think it was 300 people over a period of, some absurd amount of time. The intervention was approximately 9 months from memory. And what I said in the end is, as far as I could tell, it was pretty rigorous. There were a few sort of things, as there always are, that, as a scientist, I sort of said, oh, that's interesting. I might not have done it that way, or I'd like to see some more statistics or whatever. But in the end, I sort of said, yeah, it's reasonably sound. I wouldn't discard or push aside the findings. However, the interesting thing about it to me was that the intervention they used was not necessarily consistent with known mindfulness definitions or known mindfulness interventions. And while I appreciate their work and I appreciate their effort and what they did, and they had a particular objective, I think it's a good example of new interventions or new methods of studying this propagating. And one of the issues with that is, if you do something that varies enough from what we already have, we can't really conclude that you're studying mindfulness, nor can we say you're not studying mindfulness. So I think this is what we've seen a lot in the literature, is that, the people who don't have much money have really been trying hard to do their best on a limited budget. And a lot of times, they're doing really great work. But, as you said, if you've only got $20,000 and you spend all your money on brain scans, that's only 20 participants.
Right.
And, you're going to probably lose some of them because they're moving their heads and things like that. So, and then to see sort of these large studies where, and not to say that they're bad by any means, but, it's just where they sort of invented or utilized a new intervention that combines different components of mindfulness-based stress reduction or compassion and other things. It's a little frustrating in some ways, because they're adding to sort of a body of evidence that we can't necessarily align with what we already know.
You did a different measure. You did a different experiment.
Exactly. And while that experiment may be very useful and very informative overall for psychology overall or neuroscience overall, it's sort of, in the end, the question is, well, what questions does it answer? Does it tell us whether mindfulness works for something? And I don't know that it does that. It says some interesting things, but, in the end, the conclusions have to be limited to what the data can tell you. And that's not something that people always appreciate.
I wanted to add I found the Scientific American article to be pretty balanced and to be a pretty good one. And hats off to Dave Vago for the one he did, the Newsweek one, which I didn't, but I do want to say, well, two things. First, the headlines I picked were the outrageous ones, the most outrageous ones I could find. So I did it too for this.
Yeah. Of course, but that's what everyone wants to discuss.
And I will also state that the science journalist for Newsweek who put that article together did respond right away when I sent an email with some some pushback on the titling and is forwarding that up the editorial chain.
Well, that's
I
good.
think one of the challenges that in scientific studies getting into the popular media is that the researchers typically don't get a final say on what the title or a final review of the paper, and sometimes neither does the science journals themselves. There's someone else who says, no, we need clicks, and they'll change it.
Yeah, and that's true. Look, particularly at the headlines. I had this recently where, I had some discussions with various senior colleagues about this. And as I've been through this process, I'm myself quite junior and really new to really kind of having this much media attention. And absolutely, I was told, that the titles are pretty much off limits. And, whatever you think the title is going in, you really have little to no control over that at the outset. So, and as you said, like even the journalists may have no control over the actual title. Right. Or the images that go along with it. Those are really designed, I think, to, further or advance the agenda of the media outlet, which is to get people to subscribe or listen to them, and so I think that's important. In the end, I would say, and other people have said this, maybe in some ways it's some not Buddhist, but other sense of karma in that, given how much overhyped, extreme positive, we've listed a couple of the headlines in our paper of supercharging your brain and extending your life and things like that. It might be an appropriate balance to those kinds of things in some ways. I'm not saying I endorse the title, but, in the long run, and I think the thing you can take away from it is if it gets people to actually look at some of our commentary, if it gets people talking, then I'm okay with it. And I'm okay with it not because of it exactly what it is, but I'm okay that at least it engages people in the conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting that I've had a few conversations online, as I know you as well. You've been in several of them where there have been some, oh, see, I knew it didn't work. This is all, and they're completely dismissing everything, and others who are, well, but it's great. And the passion of those who are part of this, for many of us, we care about this. It's why we were part of this project in the first place. And to see that, there's a dismissal in some way of, oh, science is just ruining this ancient tradition. Like, no, we're doing something different. We're not taking away from how you're engaging. And many of us who are authors, and I've had to say that several times just today online, I am one of the folks whose name is on that. We care. That's why we put this out there. And that point is sometimes missed in the popular media, where people don't actually click on the link and read the paper itself.
They read the headlines, and look, to just give you a personal angle on this, just to express, some of the passion that various authors and their affiliation with this. My personal reason for doing this is because meditation and MBSR and MBCT have personally been very helpful to me, and I've found them to be very helpful in some version with clients that I've seen clinically. And that's part of why I did this. And the reason being that I was just about ready 3 years ago to give up. I was just about ready to be done with mindfulness research because I was so disappointed by the quality and the rigor, or the lack thereof, in the work that was being done. And I was disappointed by the fact that people weren't sort of calling out some of these puff pieces, and they were just letting go, the HuffPost's endorsement and constant pushing of this is the solution for everything, and, the corporatization of mindfulness. And so essentially, this was kind of, in some ways, I viewed this as nothing to lose. I viewed it as a last ditch effort to try to save mindfulness, honestly, to try and make it, to try and create a way where we could actually test scientifically what I thought personally was the real potential of this. And if it didn't work, then for me, it was kind of like, well, I don't know that I can be a part of it anymore, and honestly, it was from a place of caring about it. And I thought, from that point of caring about it, if we can't do it right, then I don't know that I can be part of it. And that's how I felt. And actually, there's other authors on this article who have since sort of talked about whether, or their own struggles of sort of wanting to be involved with meditation research, given how important a role in their life meditation is. And so I know this is a constant battle for us people who do this and who are involved in this work, where, if mindfulness or meditation is an important part of our personal lives, it's hard to do this objectively, and it's hard to do the rigorous research, oftentimes getting results that aren't consistent with what you feel personally. And so I think the point being, in the end, we're not trying to take anything personal away from anyone.
Right.
We're just trying to say, look, the people that read this from a scientific perspective want rigorous evidence, and they're not going to believe us. They're not going to agree that this has any potential if they don't see good, solid evidence. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're arguing for. We're not saying, you should throw it all out. We're not saying you should do all of it and love it. We're saying, look, just hold on for a minute. Just give us some time to actually let the field evolve a little bit. Let us grow this research and let us see where it best works and where it doesn't. I think, and this is a problem, and this is, I've encountered this in a slightly different perspective. You may be aware of some of Jim Coyne, and you may be aware of some of his recent comments on our article. Jim thought we should have named names, and he thought we should have said who were the worst perpetrators of poor mindfulness research. And my response to that, and this is personal, I tried to sort of say what I thought the rest of the authors would have thought. But I sort of was speaking for myself. I don't think that that's necessarily helpful. I think that the people who do this research, for the most part, I don't know. I think the majority of people, though, they have good intentions. And I think they genuinely care, and they want they want to test something they think might really help people. And so the reason, there's two reasons that I didn't or won't name names. Well, there's three, actually. One is I don't know people's conflicts of interest, and it's not my job, nor do I have time to go digging into people's financial records, even if I did have access.
You're not the mindfulness police.
I don't care. Yes, exactly. I'm not going to self-appoint myself as the mindfulness police. I don't think it's helpful, honestly. If I start calling people out, they're not going to talk with me. If I start saying, Dr. X is a crappy researcher, I've essentially eliminated the possibility of having a meaningful, real conversation with me, because I put that person on the offensive. Mm-hmm. And I think more importantly, and this is a point that I made, and I was covered nicely in the Inverse article that covered this, that in the end, and this goes back to your point, the people that want to dismiss mindfulness are going to do so no matter what is said. And the people that want to do mindfulness and want to say that it's the best thing ever and it will fix everything are probably going to say that no matter what. And so realistically, the people that follow the charlatans, so to speak, and whether they're on either side, there are charlatans certainly on the nay side as well as on the pro side. I think I don't know. Me calling them charlatans or calling them quacks, not only does it eliminate a possible conversation with me with the individual, the scientist, whoever, but it eliminates more importantly, I think it eliminates a conversation for me with, or any of us, with the followers. Right. And that's really a concern, right? Because in the end, who I really want this to reach is the people who are doing it. And if in the end, some of these people are willing to go, just because my therapist says that he or she is doing mindfulness-based work may not mean it's actually mindfulness-based. They may have just redressed some other crap, some thought, feel, touch therapy thing, or something like that has no evidence. And they're charging me money for it. And so maybe I should actually try and look into whether or not what they do is actually mindfulness.
So you had an interesting bit of information about how this has been received and how it's getting a lot of attention right now. I'm wondering if you could talk to some of the metrics that you found.
Sure. So this is quite interesting in the sense that, alt metrics are a new thing and a relatively new thing in science. And so we've got what's called an alt metric score at the present moment of 398. Now, to give you some perspective on that, it's a composite score that weights various outlets, so news media, blogs, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And sort of the better or the higher quality
the greater rigor of the outlet, the more weight it gets to the score. So, for example, the New York Times adds more points to your score than does HuffPost. Mm-hmm. You can talk to Ariana about why that might be if you'd like to. But 398, I mean, just to give you an example, a piece that was actually reasonably discussed of mine around diagnoses in psychiatry, I think had an altmetric score maybe in the 20s or 30s. And that piece was actually, I'm very proud of that piece, and it was a hell of a lot of work to do the analysis, and it was very complicated. And it was pretty widely discussed. Not necessarily picked up by a lot of media, but pretty widely discussed. So, I mean, a score of almost 400 is pretty impressive. And what that actually means, that what they give you here, I'm looking at the summary, it's in the top 5% of all research outputs scored by Altmetric, right? So that's all outputs, all scientific articles. Interestingly, it's number 12 of all articles published in the journal that we published it in. So that's 684 articles over God knows how many years. It's in the 99th percentile for attention score compared to outputs of the same age. It's been covered by 27 news outlets, 3 blogs, and it's from a particular website where I have it's saying it's been tweeted by 231 people. Now, I actually happen to know that there's a hell of a lot more tweeters. So I've gotten comments from a lot of them. So, I mean, and geographically, there's another interesting thing where I'm in Australia, and, there's been quite a lot of attention here in Australia. There's been attention in Europe and in the UK. There's been attention in various parts of North America. So we're really getting coverage and attention all around the world. And it really is pretty impressive the extent to which people are discussing this and clearly have an opinion and care. Yeah. So yeah, I've been very pleased with how well it's sort of getting out there.
So speaking of the caring part, what are some of your personal hopes about the future outcomes from this article? What do you hope happens?
Well, what I'd really like to happen is, I think, one of the reasons sort of that I was happy, and apart from personal reasons, to come to Australia, is that there is a strong collaborative spirit here, and part of what that has to do, and just to use this as a microcosm, the research budget in Australia obviously is substantially smaller than that in the United States, and that's just because it's a much smaller country with a lot fewer people. So, but the attitude here essentially is, because we're dealing with a much smaller pool, the only way that we can do the best quality work is to combine our efforts so that we can band together and try to agree on some common terms, some common goals. And although we can't always study all of our individual, pet interests and ideas and areas that we care about most, if we can agree at least to some common things, we can achieve a lot. And that's the hope for mine in this area, not here in Australia necessarily, but across the world in mindfulness research. What I hope will happen is that this might encourage people to say, I want a skeptic on my team. I want a Buddhist scholar on my team. I want, a neuroscientist. I want a psychologist, and what I want to do actually is, I want to pool my resources. I want to take that 20,000 that I had, and not just scan 20 people, but I want to find other people who also want to know whether this legitimately works in a rigorous context, and try and maybe pool resources and try and do some larger, bigger, better studies. Because, there are the sort of grassroots researchers, as I like to think of them, that are trying to go it alone. And I think, we're often hurt by the fact that, we just can't accrue the sample sizes that are needed to do some of this work. And that doesn't mean we can't do meaningful work. It just means that, we have to be more strategic in how we think about doing it. The other thing that I really hope is that this, in some ways, influences those individuals who can do the meaningful work. I hope that that the people who are able to get samples of 300 and attract $5 million in funding will read this article and say, okay, maybe we should talk to these people. Maybe we should ask some of them for advice. Maybe we should think about how we're going about this and ensure that that $5 million has the maximum output and influence that it can. And I think, to be honest, those if you've been given $5 million to do a research project, you have a hell of a lot more obligation to the public who gave that money to you, or the foundation that gave that money to you, to get it right than I do if I, am cobbling together $20,000. You should be treating it though the same way that I do, right? Which is that in the end, it's not just about getting good publications. It's not just about getting more grants. If you truly sort of have a mindful attitude, right? If you truly appreciate this stuff, then in the end, what you care about is the truth. What you care about is reality. You care about sort of seeing things clearly. And you should use that mindset of why you're personally passionate about mindfulness to influence and inform the research that you do about it.
Beautifully said. Our guest today, Nicholas T. Van Dam. You can find out more about Nicholas and his work. I have some links on the episode page for this episode, but you can find him on nicholastvandam.com. Nicholas, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate your time today. And here's hoping there's some positive influence coming from this work.
It's been a pleasure.